Welcome to History Echoes 2026. We are going to spend considerable time today examining one of the most consequential economic catastrophes in modern history, the Great Depression that began in late 1929 and lasted through much of the 1930s. This event did not merely affect bank accounts or stock tickers. It reshaped governments, altered societies, redrew political maps, influenced the rise of authoritarian regimes, contributed to the conditions that led to the Second World War, and left behind institutions and ideas that still govern large parts of economic life today. Many of its underlying causes, warning signs, policy mistakes, and long-term consequences appear again, sometimes faintly, sometimes quite clearly. In the economic and political discussions of 2026, we will proceed slowly and methodically. First, we will look at the years leading up to the crisis so you can see how the weaknesses accumulated. Then, we will walk through the crash itself, the banking failures, the human suffering, the spread to other continents, the policy responses in the United States and elsewhere, the political transformations that followed, the international lessons that were drawn, and finally, the reasons why so many observers in 2026 feel that certain patterns are reappearing. The story properly begins in the aftermath of the First World War. When the armistice was signed in November 1918, Europe lay in ruins. France had lost more than 1 million soldiers and seen large parts of its industrial northeast occupied and devastated. Belgium was similarly damaged. Britain had accumulated enormous war debts. Germany faced reparations payments under the Treaty of Versailles that were intended to cover Allied reconstruction costs and pensions for war widows and veterans. The Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires had dissolved, leaving new states with fragile economies and disputed borders. The United States, by contrast, had suffered relatively light casualties, had lent rather than borrowed during the war, and possessed intact industrial capacity. American farms and factories had supplied food, munitions, and raw materials to the Allies on a massive scale. By 1919, the United States held a significant portion of the world's gold reserves and had become the principal creditor nation. The 1920s opened with optimism in many quarters. In the United States, the decade earned the name Roaring Twenties. Consumer goods became widely available. The Ford Motor Company's assembly line had made the Model T affordable for middle-class families. By the mid-1920s, more than 1 in 5 American households owned an automobile. Radio broadcasting expanded rapidly. KDKA in Pittsburgh made the first commercial broadcast in 1920, and within a few years, millions of homes had receivers. Motion pictures evolved from silent shorts to feature-length talkies. Department stores and mail-order catalogs brought a wider range of clothing and appliances into ordinary homes. Many purchases were made on installment credit, buy now, pay later, because incomes appeared to be rising and confidence was high. The stock market reflected that optimism. The Dow Jones Industrial Average rose from about 63 in 1921 to a peak of 381 in September 1929. Ordinary citizens who had never owned shares before began investing, often on margin, borrowing up to 90% of the purchase price from brokers. Banks were eager to lend because margin loans carried high interest rates and the collateral was the stock itself. If prices kept rising, everyone won. The belief that prosperity was permanent became widespread. Yet several structural weaknesses were quietly growing. American farmers had enjoyed high prices during the war because European agriculture was disrupted. When peace returned, European production resumed and demand for U.S. grain declined. At the same time, new mechanized farming techniques increased output. Supply outran demand. Wheat, corn, and cotton prices fell sharply in the early 1920s. Farmers who had borrowed heavily to buy land and tractors found themselves unable to service those loans. Rural bank failures began well before the 1929 crash. Industrial overcapacity also developed. Factories had expanded to meet wartime needs and then post-war consumer demand. By the late 1920s, many sectors, automobiles, appliances, textiles, were producing more than the domestic market could absorb. Wages for industrial workers, while higher than before the war, had not kept pace with productivity gains or with the rising cost of living in cities. Purchasing power lagged behind output. Income and wealth inequality reached extreme levels. By 1928, the top 1% of Americans received nearly 1/4 of all personal income, while the bottom 90% shared the remainder. Much of the decade's consumption was financed by debt rather than broad-based wage growth. The economy became dangerously dependent on continued borrowing by households and continued investment by the wealthy. The international financial system added fragility. Most major economies remained on the gold standard, which tied the money supply to the amount of gold held by central banks. Gold movements enforced painful contractions. When a country lost gold through trade deficits or capital flight, it had to raise interest rates or restrict credit to attract gold back, slowing the domestic economy. The United States had accumulated a large share of the world's monetary gold after the war, but it did not recycle that gold smoothly through lower interest rates or higher imports. Instead, high U.S. tariffs, including the Fordney-Macumber Act of 1922, made it difficult for European debtors to earn dollars to service their loans. The stock market boom masked these problems for several years. Margin debt soared. Speculation became frenzied. In March 1929, the Federal Reserve raised the discount rate to 6% in an attempt to cool the market, but the action came too late to prevent the bubble from growing further. The crash arrived in stages. On Thursday, October 24, 1929, Black Thursday, heavy selling overwhelmed the ticker tape. Prices dropped sharply. Leading bankers gathered at J.P. Morgan & Company and agreed to buy shares to stabilize the market. The effort succeeded temporarily, but confidence had been shaken. Over the weekend, newspapers carried stories of ruin. On Monday, October 28, selling resumed. The Dow fell 13%. On Tuesday, October 29, Black Tuesday, panic became uncontrollable. More than 16 million shares changed hands, a record that stood for decades. Prices collapsed. Margin calls forced brokers to sell clients' holdings. Billions of dollars of paper wealth evaporated. The immediate economic impact was severe. Investors who had borrowed to buy stocks were wiped out. Brokers who had extended credit faced losses. Banks that held stocks as collateral or had lent heavily for speculation became vulnerable. Depositors, fearing for their savings, began withdrawing funds. Bank runs spread. Between 1930 and 1933, more than 9,000 banks suspended operations. Because there was no federal deposit insurance, millions of families lost their entire savings. Credit dried up. Businesses could not borrow to meet payrolls or purchase inventory. Factories laid off workers or closed entirely. Retail sales plummeted. Construction stopped. Unemployment rose month after month. By early 1933, roughly 13 million Americans, 1 in 4 of the workforce, had no job. Those who kept work often faced wage cuts of 30 to 50%. The human cost was immense. In cities, families doubled up in apartments or moved into shantytowns nicknamed Hoovervilles after the president many blamed for inaction. Bread lines and soup kitchens became commonplace. School attendance dropped because children lacked shoes or food. Malnutrition spread. Suicide rates rose. In rural areas, the situation was equally grim. Farmers could not sell crops for enough to cover debts or taxes. Foreclosures became widespread. In the Great Plains, a combination of drought, overplowing, and high winds created the Dust Bowl. Topsoil blew away in massive black blizzards. Farms turned to desert. Hundreds of thousands of families, the Okies and Arkies, described in John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, loaded their remaining possessions onto trucks and drove west toward California, hoping for agricultural work. The crisis spread internationally because the world economy was more interconnected than most people realized. The United States had been the world's largest creditor since the war. American banks and investors had loaned billions to European governments and businesses. When Wall Street collapsed, those banks recalled loans to shore up their own balance sheets. Debtors in Germany, Austria, Britain, and Latin America could not repay. A banking crisis that began in Vienna in May 1931 spread to Germany and then to London. Britain abandoned the gold standard in September 1931, letting the pound depreciate to make exports cheaper. Many countries followed. Currency devaluations helped individual nations, but made international debt repayment more difficult because debts were denominated in stronger currencies. Global trade contracted severely. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, signed by President Hoover in June 1930, raised average duties to nearly 60% on dutiable imports. More than 1,000 economists had petitioned the president to veto the bill, warning that it would provoke retaliation and shrink trade. They were correct. Canada, Britain, France, Italy, and others raised their own tariffs. World trade volume fell by approximately 66% between 1929 and 1934. Nations turned inward, seeking self-sufficiency. The result was a vicious circle. Less trade meant lower incomes, which meant even less demand for imports, which meant more unemployment and more pressure for protectionism. Political systems came under strain almost everywhere. In the United States, President Hoover maintained that the federal government should not provide direct relief because it would undermine self-reliance. He favored voluntary cooperation by business and limited public works. By 1932, public patience had run out. Franklin D. Roosevelt won a landslide victory in November, promising a New Deal for the American people. When he took office in March 1933, the banking system was near collapse. Roosevelt acted decisively. He declared a national bank holiday, closing every bank for 4 days to stop withdrawals. He then reopened only those banks deemed solvent. In his first fireside chat, broadcast nationwide on radio, he spoke in calm, reassuring tones, explaining the banking measures and asking citizens to redeposit their money. The panic subsided. The New Deal unfolded in two main waves, the first 100 days of 1933 and the second New Deal of 1935 to 1938. Relief came quickly. The Civilian Conservation Corps enrolled young men in conservation work, planting trees, building trails, fighting forest fires, and sent most of their pay home to families. The Federal Emergency Relief Administration distributed grants to states for direct aid to the unemployed. The Works Progress Administration eventually employed more than 8 million people on public projects, roads, schools, hospitals, airports, post offices, parks, and even artistic and theatrical programs. Recovery measures aimed to restart economic activity. The National Industrial Recovery Act created codes of fair competition for industries, setting minimum wages, maximum hours, and production limits. The Agricultural Adjustment Act paid farmers to reduce acreage so crop prices could recover. The Tennessee Valley Authority built dams and power plants, bringing electricity and flood control to one of the poorest regions in the country. Reforms sought to prevent future crises. The Glass-Steagall Act separated commercial banking from investment banking. The Securities Act of 1933 required companies to disclose financial information before issuing stock. The Securities Exchange Act of 1934 created the Securities and Exchange Commission to regulate markets. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation insured bank deposits up to a certain amount, ending the fear of losing savings. The Social Security Act of 1935 established old age pensions and unemployment insurance, the foundation of the modern American welfare state. The New Deal did not end the Depression. Unemployment remained above 10% until the late 1930s. Some economists argue that only the enormous government spending required for World War II finally produced full employment. Yet the New Deal changed the role of government permanently. It established that the state has a responsibility to provide economic security, regulate financial markets, and act as a stabilizer during downturns. Elsewhere, the Depression accelerated authoritarian trends. In Germany, reparations, hyperinflation in the early 1920s, and then the global slump created fertile ground for extremism. Unemployment reached 6 million by 1932. The Weimar Republic's coalition governments appeared paralyzed. Adolf Hitler's National Socialist Party promised jobs, national revival, and an end to the Versailles humiliation. They became the largest party in the Reichstag in 1932 and took power legally in January 1933. Once in office, they dismantled democracy, banned opposition parties, and began rearmament. In Italy, Benito Mussolini had already consolidated power in the 1920s. The Depression strengthened his corporatist model, state direction of industry, and suppression of independent unions. In Japan, economic hardship and resentment over naval treaties with the West fueled military influence. The army seized control of Manchuria in 1931 and moved toward full militarization. The Depression exposed the fragility of liberal democracy when economic security collapses. Millions lost faith in markets and parliaments. Strong leaders promising decisive action gained appeal. One of the clearest international lessons was the damage caused by protectionism. The Smoot-Hawley tariff triggered retaliation worldwide. Trade barriers multiplied. Global commerce contracted. Economists later concluded that those tariffs prolonged the Depression and deepened suffering. After 1945, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade was created precisely to prevent a return to the 1930s cycle. Banking lessons were equally stark. Mass failures destroyed money supply and confidence. Deposit insurance and stronger supervision became standard. Fiscal policy lessons emerged as well. The New Deal showed that government spending can create demand when private spending collapses. John Maynard Keynes's ideas about counter-cyclical policy gained wider acceptance. Now consider the present year, 2026. Tariffs are once again a central policy tool. Duties on imports from China remain elevated. Additional tariffs have been threatened or imposed on allies over disputes ranging from critical minerals to territorial questions. Governments speak openly of reshoring manufacturing and reducing dependence on foreign supply chains. Some economists warn that escalating trade barriers could slow global growth, raise consumer prices, and reduce efficiency. Echoes of the early 1930s retaliation spiral. Global debt stands at unprecedented levels, more than $300 trillion when combining public, corporate, and household borrowing. In the 1930s, excessive leverage contributed to defaults and banking crises. Today, if interest rates remain elevated or growth weakens unexpectedly, servicing that debt becomes more challenging, especially for heavily indebted emerging markets and certain advanced economies. Inequality remains pronounced. Income and wealth gains since the 2008 financial crisis have concentrated at the top. The middle and working classes in many countries face stagnant real wages, rising housing costs, and uncertainty about the future. That disparity breeds resentment and strengthens populist movements, a dynamic visible in the 1930s when economic pain eroded faith in moderate governments. Government intervention has increased. Large-scale spending on infrastructure, green energy, defense, and social programs is common across many nations. Central banks continue to use unconventional tools, low or negative interest rates, asset purchases to support growth. These actions reflect the post-depression consensus that policy can and should stabilize economies during downturns. At the same time, trust in institutions has weakened in many societies. Confidence in banks, legislatures, international organizations, and even media has declined. That erosion of trust was a hallmark of the 1930s, when disillusionment opened the door to extreme alternatives. Technology has changed the speed and reach of both problems and responses. Financial markets react instantly. Information, accurate or false, spreads worldwide in seconds. Supply chains are global and tightly integrated, so a disruption in one place affects production everywhere. Yet central banks can adjust policy rapidly. Governments can distribute aid digitally. International coordination, when it occurs, can happen in days rather than years. The core human elements, fear of loss, anger at perceived unfairness, the desire for simple explanations, and decisive action, remain the same as they were in the 1930s. The Great Depression left several enduring lessons. First, prompt action matters. Waiting for markets to self-correct allowed the downturn to deepen. Second, protecting ordinary citizens is essential. Mass unemployment and loss of savings destroy confidence and prolong suffering. Third, protectionism is self-defeating. Trade barriers shrink the global economy and invite retaliation. Fourth, international cooperation is indispensable. No single nation can isolate itself from a worldwide contraction. Fifth, institutions must earn and maintain public trust. When people believe the system works for them, they are more willing to support it. Those lessons informed the post-war order. The Marshall Plan rebuilt Western Europe. The Bretton Woods system stabilized currencies and lending. The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade reduced trade barriers. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank provided mechanisms for assistance and coordination. That framework helped prevent another depression-scale collapse for more than 7 decades. In 2026, elements of that framework are under pressure. Some governments question its fairness or effectiveness. Others seek to renegotiate or bypass its rules. If cooperation weakens and each nation prioritizes narrow self-interest, the risk of repeating earlier errors rises. History does not repeat itself precisely. Circumstances are never identical. Yet certain patterns recur. Excessive debt, widening inequality, protectionist impulses, erosion of institutional trust. These were central to the 1930s and are visible again today. Whether 2026 becomes a difficult chapter or an opportunity to apply hard-won wisdom depends on the choices made in the months and years ahead. Thank you for joining me in this extended exploration. History Echoes 2026 will continue to examine the past with an eye on the present. If this discussion was useful, please like the video and leave a comment. Which historical period or event would you like explored next? Subscribe and enable notifications so you receive each new episode. Take care, and we will speak again soon.